Joshua Havlovsky, is a landscape ecologist with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. He holds a BA in Environmental Science from Washington University in St. Louis, an MS degree in Geography from Rutgers University, and as a PhD in Forestry and Wildlife from Oregon State University. His interests include trophic cascades theory, multiple scale analysis, and working at the interface of science and management. So, Josh?
I first want to thank the conference organizers for inviting our lab to come speak today. We were asked to essentially summarize the work we've conducted in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem for roughly the last decade, and that work's focused around trophic cascades and aspen recruitment. And because we're summarizing the work, I'll be glossing over a lot of details, but I'll be happy to discuss those details with you during the Q&A session afterwards, later on in the day, or even sometime tomorrow. And the other thing to note is you'll notice a lot of citations throughout this presentation. The papers associated with those citations can actually be downloaded from a website that's provided in the abstract summary in the conference proceedings. So with that, let's begin. I first want to present some results from historic aspen studies that we've conducted in the park. Actually, historic recruitment studies, not necessarily just aspen. And in my mind, these are really very useful for looking at long-term trends and patterns in recruitment, and then we're therefore able to assess or compare those long-term historic trends to what we're seeing currently in the landscape. So the first study I'll be presenting was an aspen recruitment study conducted in the northern range of the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone National Park. And this aspen recruitment study will really be focused within the park boundary, within this orange polygon. Here we have an aspen recruitment diagram on the x-axis. We have origination decade on the y-axis. We have the percent of aspen trees sampled. Again, this is a recruitment graph, so you can think of these as the number of aspen trees that originated within a certain decade. And really, I'm more interested in you looking at the overall pattern of this graph rather than the specific numbers. What we see is a unimodal or hump-shaped distribution to aspen recruitment. The fact that we see fewer and fewer aspen trees as we go further back in time really isn't surprising. Aspen live anywhere from 80 to 150 years on average in this area. So the fact that we see fewer aspen as we go back in time is really likely due to just natural stand or tree mortality. However, what is a little bit disconcerting to me is that we see fewer and fewer aspen as we get closer and closer to the present. If this was a healthy reproducing aspen population, we would expect to see more and more aspen as we get closer and closer to the present, not fewer and fewer. To tie this off, we see recruitment peaks in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We essentially see no aspen recruitment from roughly the 1930s into the present. We can look at this, and the data would suggest that, yes, aspen are not recruiting within the study area, but we can also look at other species like cottonwood. And the key here is we're again seeing a decline in cottonwood recruitment with this data, and again, this data was collected within this orange polygon, so in the same area as the aspen. And we're seeing a minimal to no aspen cottonwood recruitment, as we get closer and closer to the present. So now we're seeing a similar pattern and lack of response of certain species as we get closer and closer to the present. Going to a different area of the park, what I want to do now is overlay results of another aspen recruitment study on top of this study, again, from where this study was from that orange polygon. The other study was in the very northwest corner of the park, represented by that green polygon there. And as we overlay those results on top, we see a very similar pattern. Again, we see this unimodal or hump-shaped distribution in aspen recruitment. And we essentially have no aspen recruitment from the 1950s until the late 1990s. So now we're seeing this pattern across species and across areas within the park. So from this, again, the data is very suggestive that something is going on to these trees. Something very broad scale is occurring. But what's interesting is we can just go right outside the park boundary in the northwest corner of the park and look at two exclosures. One literally a stone's throw away from the park boundary. It's called the Crown Butte exclosure, and the other exclosure is roughly 6 miles or 10 kilometers north of the park boundary, and it's called the Porcupine exclosure. And what we see is a very different pattern. Both elk exclosures were constructed in 1945. And what we see, rather than that hump-shaped distribution, is coinciding with the construction of these exposures, we see a continuous and increasing amount of aspen recruitment as we get closer and closer to the present. Again, very different pattern than what we see inside the park boundary. Here's some photos that kind of illustrate the data I just presented to you. In the lower left-hand corner is what I call your typical winter range aspen stand. You have sparse canopies, and what's really telling is that you can see through these stands. They're just not recruiting. Although I'd like to mention that we laid out transects in these stands. We were averaging over roughly 2,500 sprouts on a per hectare basis, indicating that these aspen stands in the winter range are producing new sprouts, at least currently, but for some reason they're not growing into mature trees. If we contrast that with what we're seeing in the exposures, and as the data on the previous slide suggested, we see very different patterns. What's probably very hard to see, but what we've seen in other presentations today, is that there's no aspen recruitment occurring just outside this fence. It's all occurring inside the fence. Looking at the porcupine exposure a little more carefully, there's this great photo sequence taken through time. The first two photos were collected by Charles Kay, who, as most of you likely know, has done a lot of the detailed aspen work in the northern Rockies. Well, what's really great or interesting about this photo sequence is that when this fence was constructed, it actually bisected a single aspen stand. So what we have through time is a photo sequence where we can look at what happened to this aspen stand, a portion of which was inside the exposure through time, and a portion of which is outside the exposure through time. And by 2003, in my mind, this is very reminiscent of what I call your typical winter range aspen stand. Sparse canopy, again, you can see through it. You compare that to inside the exposure, and again, you see a very different pattern. So if we think about the reasons for aspen decline that have been discussed repeatedly throughout this conference, we can think about conifer encroachment, but to tell you the truth, we didn't find any sort of pattern between conifer encroachment and aspen recruitment, at least in the northwest corner of the park. And as you can tell, conifer encroachment doesn't appear to be a very large issue, at least this point in time. This area did not burn in the '88 fires, and I'd be pretty hard to press to say fire occurred within these exposures versus outside. Similarly, it's hard to say that climate's different inside the fenced area versus outside. And simply through process of elimination, this left our group with this idea of browsing. Browsing is different inside these exposure fences, we would hope, than outside. And those 2,500 per hectare sprouts I mentioned earlier in the top, over 90% have been browsed within the last year. So at least it does appear that browsing is an issue. But the question that's raised in our lab is, assuming browsing is currently and historically been an issue for aspen recruitment, as well as maybe some other deciduous species, why did we only start to see this pattern reported in the literature through newspaper clippings, GTRs or documents from Forest Service, and in the aspen themselves beginning around the 1930s? And that's where this idea of trophic cascades theory came in. Now, trophic cascades has been defined as both the direct and indirect effects a top predator can have on successively lower trophic levels. So what that would mean in this hypothesis for Yellowstone National Park is that wolves can have a direct effect on elk browsing. Now, they can affect elk browsing by lowering the densities through predation and or through changes in elk behavior. And I'll talk a little bit more about elk behavior later on in the talk. But due to these changes in elk browsing, species that are preferred by elk, such as aspen, therefore can recruit. So wolves have a direct negative effect on elk and an indirect positive effect on aspen. You take away the top predator, the theory would suggest that, or would state that herbivore densities would increase, their browsing pressures could change, and therefore other species like aspen would decline. So as I mentioned before, so if we take the studies I presented earlier and place them within this idea of trophic cascade theory, we know that wolves were extirpated from the park by around 1930, coinciding with the decline in aspen in this study. We know wolves were reintroduced into the park in the winters of 1995 and 96, coinciding with the first aspen recruitment we've seen in this study area for several decades. We go back to the studies within the orange polygon in the northern region, whether you're talking about aspen or cottonwood. This gray bar represents the area of the time of wolf absence. So again, we see this similar pattern of a lack of recruitment coinciding when wolves were not present in the system. So those are sort of the historic studies that kind of led us to this idea that there could potentially be eutrophic cascades going on in the park. What I want to do now is focus on some of the studies we've conducted that have looked at current recruitment, right? If you recall, according to the theory, with wolf reintroduction, we would expect changes in elk browsing, and therefore potential changes in preferred browse species such as aspen. This is not an aspen photo sequence through time, it's actually a willow photo sequence through time. This was in the northwest corner of the park. It's called the snowflake exclosure. You can see the willow, they're the dark stems. They're only being found in that 1969 photo inside the exclosure, yet by 2003, you can't even see the fence in some areas, indicating that the willow has started to recruit outside of the exclosure. So we're starting to see a plant response, at least in willow. In an earlier talk, it was mentioned that you can read the stems, or you can look at the browsing pattern on aspen to determine whether or not they've been browsed. So we take advantage of this plant architecture or growth patterns on plants like willow and aspen, and we can start to read back and look at the history, browsing history, and growth heights through time. And so I know this is an aspen conference, but I just want to mention, to show this pattern at least, to mention that this pattern occurs on other species. So all we really do to read this is say in 1998, plant heights were on average 50 centimeters tall, yet by 2002, plants are roughly 200 centimeters in height. Again, we can take advantage of the plant architecture or browsing history to kind of create a fuller picture of what was going on in 1998. So not only do we know that plants are on average 50 centimeters in height, but we also know that over 90% of those stems were browsed. And what we see is an inverse pattern between percentage of stem browse and plant height through time. So as plants, in this case willow, grew through time, we see a decrease in browsing. It's an inverse relationship. We can look at aspen recruitment that's now occurring in the park, and we see, again, as aspen have grown in height, we've seen a decrease in browsing pressure. So we're seeing, again, the same sort of inverse relationship. We're not finding this relationship due to fire effects or necessarily climate, but we are seeing this correlative evidence due to this browsing pressure. So I want to take these two graphs and move to a different area of the park. This is an area that a part of which did burn in the 1988 fires. Now, we just stumbled across this. It was very fortuitous and happenstance that we came across this area, but it really, really excited us. These candy striped bars represent roughly 1 meter in height, and not only did a third of the area not burn in the fire, and adjacent 2/3 of the study area did burn in the fire. We're talking about a pretty small area in total and relatively flat topography. In terms of the study area length, it's roughly at its longest 3 kilometers, not very long, and maybe at its widest 1.5 to 2 kilometers. So because it was a small area and relatively flat topography, we made 2 assumptions in this study. One, we assumed that the climate was similar between the burned and unburned area, but we also assumed that browsing opportunities were also similar between these 2 areas. By making those 2 assumptions, we were therefore able to ask or look at how aspen recruited in an area that burned under browsing pressure. And so just like some of the preceding slides, we're going to look at year on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we're going to have plant height growth through time, and this is for the burned area. So we see through time these plants on average grew from being 75 centimeters tall to all the way to being over 350 centimeters tall. Now this is really exciting to us. As far as we know, this is the first reported upland aspen recruitment reported for the park for several decades. So it's really exciting for us. And just like other studies, we saw this increase in height with a decrease in browsing. Now, first note that we had almost 100% of these stems browsed in 1995 and 96, again illustrating that these areas were accessible to elk and they were being heavily browsed. Now, some of you may think, well, sure, these plants grew, but they didn't stop being browsed, but maybe they stopped being browsed because they were outside or beyond the reach of elk. If you think elk can browse to roughly 200 to 250 centimeters, it's a very logical conclusion to make. And that may be part of the story for some of the stems, but on average, these stems stopped being browsed when they were 114 centimeters in height. So they stopped being browsed on average well within the reach of elk, indicating that this isn't just stems growing outside beyond the reach of elk browse. Now we compare this pattern to the unburned area, and we see that it's very, very different. What we see is over 75% of the stems in the unburned area were browsed between 1995 and 2001, and we're only now starting to see a decrease in browsing in the unburned area. And we're only with that decrease in browsing are we slowly starting to see an increase in plant height. And so we think this is a hypothesis because we don't actually know elk densities in this area. The census information is not collected. But we think that for upland aspen, fire can influence the growth or the response of aspen in two ways. One is that it can increase aspen densities and growth. But the other thing is that we think that these thickets that produce are actually an example of predation risk on elk. We think that there have been a lot of studies on elk behavior in the park, and there have been a lot of studies that have documented changes in elk behavior since wolf reintroduction. Changes in daily and seasonal movement patterns, changes in predation risk measured by vigilance behavior, so how frequently an elk looks at its surroundings, assessing its surroundings to see if they are in fact in risk of predation. I'm going to have to skip, and I'm sorry about this. But what we wanted to do is, while we proposed this sort of mechanism of predation risk impacting aspen recruitment, what we wanted to do is go out and actually test that theory in the field. You see, when we're talking about aspen recruitment, it's been a very patchy phenomenon in the park. Same with willow and cottonwood. We're not getting this sort of response everywhere in the park. And so what we wanted to do is actually look at vigilance levels as a measure of predation risk. It's been used by many scientists in the literature, and to see where elk are being most vigilant. And so we went out and looked at this vigilance response in female elk, females with calves and without, and we then ran a series of regressions to see what explanatory variables best explain this vigilance. We found that females with calves tended to be more vigilant than females without calves, which is supported by other studies in the literature. But most interestingly is that we found that vigilance was greatest at closest distances to impediments of movement. Now, an impediment feature may be something like down wood, scree, or boulders, features that would cause the elk to change direction or slow down if it were to, in fact, be attacked. So if we take this idea of predation risk and the idea that elk are more vigilant and in more risky habitat when they're at closer impediment distances, we can look at some of the other studies we've looked at so far and kind of, again, add this dimension to the trophic cascade theory. The bold bar representing aspen recruitment in the northwest corner of the park, all of that recruitment occurred adjacent to steep slope scree habitat. Again, features that could be considered higher risk habitat. I don't have time, but you can imagine that areas of high density thickets could block the visibility for prey trying to assess its surroundings for a predator. It can impede the movement of an animal trying to escape, either through just being in dense thickets or through the down wood associated with those thickets. In another study of willow, Ripple and Bestruth noted that the tallest willow tended to be within 30 meters of impediments. So what did we do? We took our elk vigilance data and we split it up to look at vigilance levels of elk within 30 meters of an impediment and beyond, just to see if it would kind of fit with this observation from Ripple and Bestruth. And here we have all females on the x-axis, we have the time spent vigilant on the y-axis, and what we see is a statistically significant relationship in that females are more vigilant within 30 meters to impediments rather than beyond. Now, it's not that 30 meters is a magic number, and it's not that all female elk tend to be vigilant all the time within 30 meters, but it is, again, consistent with the observations of plant response. It's just a potential mechanism to help explain the pattern. The last one I want to present is from a Ripple and Vesta study in 2007, and we looked at they looked at riparian areas and uplands for aspen growth. Some of those riparian aspen areas had logs, some of them didn't. And for the sake of brevity, we'll just focus on this line of riparian aspen with logs. We see that they've had the greatest response or greatest increase in height through time. And just like the other studies, we see that they've had the greatest drop-off in browsing as well. And I'd like to mention that we've also seen a decrease in elk numbers through time. So obviously, we can't say this is not any sort of density-dependent phenomenon. We can't say that we're seeing an aspen in height only because of density, a drop in density in browsing. But the fact that we're not seeing a drop in browsing everywhere on the landscape, all at a similar amount, would suggest that there is some sort of behavioral response. Elk apparently preferentially stop browsing aspen in riparian areas near logs at a greater rate than in other areas. And lastly, of course, we've seen this drop in elk densities with wolves present in the system. So again, putting this in terms of trophic cascades theory, in terms of a top-down sort of system, we've seen wolf reintroduction, an increase in wolf numbers, a concurrent decrease in elk numbers. We've seen changes in browsing associated with that decrease in elk numbers, and we're therefore starting to see an increase in aspen height. Again, it's all very consistent with this idea of trophic cascades. Earlier there was a question about snag dynamics and birds, and hopefully this will address the question just a little bit. Some of our colleagues in the lab actually looked at cavity nesting bird dynamics and large diameter snags within the park and compared that to bird abundances outside of the park. What they found is that there were many, many more snags found within the park than outside of the park. And they found very little recruitment inside the park, but they also found more recruitment outside of the park associated, they think, with higher human-hunter pressure. But what's really interesting is that 6 of the 11 cavity nesting bird species were more abundant in the park where you had this significant flux of snags. And what's really kind of interesting to think about is the temporal aspect of this. What's going to happen in the future? You have very little recruitment inside the park. What's going to happen to the bird abundances once those snags took over? So it's kind of a lateral effect of a trophic cascade rather than a top-down effect. Thank you for the additional time, by the way. I do want to mention another study for those interested that's currently being conducted in North America, and specifically in Waterton Glacier National Park by Christina Eisenberg, a grad student in the lab. It's one of the largest trophic cascade studies we think that are being conducted at a cost of roughly $3 million. And it's going to be conducted over several years. She'll be looking at both density and behaviorally mediated trophic cascades. She'll be looking at additive and compensatory effects of predation, wolf predation on elk. She'll be looking overall at aspen health, and she's able to do this by looking at different wolf densities and with a lot of telemetry. So it's just something to teaser, something to look forward to down the road. So in summary, we believe that all the data is very suggestive of a trophic cascade among wolves, elk, and aspen within the park, based on the decade of work we collected and the work conducted by other scientists in the park. And lastly, I know I've been focusing a lot on trophic cascades, but for me, when we think about aspen recruitment, I have to think about successional processes and fire, and climate change, and herbivory. But now I also tend to think about predation pressure, and this can be historically by Native Americans, currently through human hunters, and of course through non-human hunters like wolves. And so rather than thinking of these as independent factors, I tend to think of these as all things that can influence aspen through space and time, and so I'd rather think of them all as part of the same mosaic of processes that can influence aspen. So with that, thank you for your patience, and if there's time, I'll take questions, and if not, I'm happy to take questions later. Any questions?
You mentioned one case where you kind of knew what the population of the large ungulates or elk were. But did I also hear you say that you don't have good records that you could overlay of elk numbers that you could overlay with the height and so on? You don't have very good numbers for the elk population in Yellowstone.
The question was related to elk densities or elk numbers, census information for the park. There's a lot of great census information in the northern range in that orange polygon, and even some in the northwest corner of the park, but specifically looking where we were for that thicket study in the part that William didn't, there is no census information. It's part of the elk spring and fall migration patterns, so it's not really collected. So I apologize if that was not clear. Yes, sir.
Any influence of the grizzlies? Was their population stable over that same period from introduction to present, or have their numbers also increased?
That's a good question. The question was grizzly populations trends. I do not know the trends of grizzly bears have increased. I do know that they predate on calves. Obviously, that's one of their primary sources. I guess the other thing to think about is that the system has had grizzlies in it and other predators in it for many, many decades without wolves, and we're not seeing this sort of plant response, and we're only starting to see it with the addition of wolves as a predator.
In our agency grizzly recovery, the population of grizzlies is steadily getting increasing, and that was justification for enlisting the grizzlies in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So there is that sort of relationship.
Thank you.
Well, I guess my question was whether it's additive or whether these are separate. You look at them completely separate.
There could be an additive effect. This study was not designed to look at whether it's an additive or compensatory effect.
Did that one graph show the population decline?
Yes, there was a slight decline in the wolf population in the last few years due to the introduction of at least in part, of a parvovirus they think it was brought in from canines. But according to 2007, the wolf population has actually increased to where it was, almost to where it was at its peak before the decline.
One more question? Was there somebody else that had a hand up? Yes, not. Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it.